Hello, we're just going to give everyone a couple minutes to get into the webinar before we begin. Alrighty, thank you so much for joining us today for our very own 2026 US Fashion Industry Benchmarking webinar. That's Sourcing Trends and Challenges in 2026, highlights from USFIA's annual Fashion Industry Benchmarking Study. My name is Sophia Wilburn, and I am the Communications Coordinator here at USFIA, and I have just a few housekeeping rules before we get started with today's program. Alrighty, questions can be submitted at any time during the live program. Simply click on the question button at the bottom of your Zoom window, type your text into the box, and hit send. The webinar will be more of a conversation, so definitely, share your questions into the question box whenever you have them. Our speakers will answer them when they're able to, and then we do have our questions at the end. Alrighty. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Sheng Liu and Emilie Delaye.
Shall we start, Sophia? Okay, so thank you so much for joining us. Such a pleasure to work with USFIA for this annual benchmarking study. As always, first of all, I would like to thank all the companies that participated in this study because your input make this report possible. So this year we are very fortunate to have 30 leading U.S. fashion companies join us. They represent, they have a balanced representation of various business type in the fashion industry, especially brands and retailers. And also they include many influential players. And also what makes me very excited this year is I finally have a co-author. So we definitely debate a lot on the data, but as always, we would love to see this report to be useful to the fashion industry, to you guys, and from the study to show the latest sourcing trends from fashion brands and retailers, their view on the industry environment, and also how critical trade policy affect fashion companies, their sourcing, and also business strategies. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, think about the entire study. Surely, this afternoon we're not going to read the report. That's too boring. I would love to, see you feel more interested in reading the report, including on Friday evening. But just think about what we take away from this year's study. I strongly believe there's a new trend, and we call it sourcing diversification 2.0. Yeah, next slide, please. So what is sourcing diversification 2.0? I think, here on the slide, you can see some of the common perception about companies, their sourcing strategy. Okay, so companies, they're sourcing from many countries or they're sourcing from more countries because of the tariff uncertainty to reduce, the sourcing risk. For a few years, companies have been reducing the so-called China exposure or, de-risking, from sourcing from China. And also, sourcing is really about, reducing, from country A, but increasing sourcing from country B and C or D. But somehow we find that this year, the practices, have some changes. Can you just click the slide? Yeah. So somehow, based on the data, from this year's survey, we find that companies' practices, have some changes. One is, even though companies, still maintain a geographically diverse sourcing base, but also companies, they're consolidating their existing sourcing base, especially at the vendor level. It's very different sentiment from last year. Companies, want to expand into more countries, work with more vendors, but this is not the case this year. Second, last year, even when we're talking about sourcing diversification, somehow, I find it's almost like they're diversifying within Asia. But this time it's very obvious. They're balancing, across regions. They want to achieve more regional balancing, not put all eggs, just in Asia, especially increase sourcing from the rest of the world. And also, the third aspect is, even though these traditional sourcing factors still matter, cost, speed to market, but increasingly, companies emphasize how flexibility and agility and also, vendors, their compliance capability will affect from where they got their products. So this is what we mean sourcing diversification 2.0, and I'll explain more later on. Yeah, next slide, please. So, what triggered this new change? I think is definitely the macro environment. Okay, very interesting when we asked companies about the top business challenges they face in 2026. Exactly the same from 2025. Exactly the same from last year, except for just a very slight order changes, but the same challenges. Well, you can say, the situation hasn't changed a lot, but also, maybe we can put it this way. Because of that, companies now see these challenges as medium to long term, or the way they respond to these challenges are not simply short-term reaction, but instead they will have to incorporate more medium to long-term strategies. Next slide, please. Yeah, so starting with tariff, I hope you love this tariff. I mean, love this graph, and I promise it's not AI generated. Um, can you click the graph? So you can choose many words to describe this graph. No, it's very concerning, very crazy, but at least you can see, from the latest few months, so it's up to May 2026. Even though the situation is stabilizing, but there is no sign the higher tariff rate or the tariff hikes are declining, are ending anytime soon. Okay. And also at the same time, okay, this time it's not just simply imports from China, it is subject to higher tariff. Truly, it's like imports from all sources, they're subject to higher tariff rates. Next slide, please. So this is why you can really see how companies respond to tariff hikes. Somehow different from last year. Last year, the impression is companies really want to avoid paying tariff, okay, or avoid being subject to the additional tariff. So, they are quickly, try to expand into more countries, try to utilize free trade agreements or renegotiate the contract with their vendors. But this year, a lot of practices become medium to long term, especially to play with the existing tariff rules, like apply for refund, use first sale. When you need to use first sale, you have to prepare a lot of documentation. And to be honest, not all, sourcing format, is a good fit for first sale. So it's definitely is a medium to long-term strategy here. And of course, there are a lot more additional measures be taken this time. And next slide. Yeah. And also, if you're looking at the impact of tariff, and or our observation is the impact of tariff go far beyond just cost. Of course, cost still is a big concern here, right? Profit margin, cost, definitely, companies are facing more pressure this year, but also, we are very concerned actually, or companies are very concerned, because of the current situation. They have to put aside a lot of strategically important issues. Like sometimes it can be sustainability, or some really, very exciting projects they would love to invest in, but because of tariff, it remains the top priority, for their company. Okay, here, maybe you wonder why not all companies say they raise their price. And I can share you briefly. I just did, one more study looking at companies, their earning call transcript. Very interesting this time. So all the transcript happened after April the 1st, and which is not a joke. It's truly, after April 1st. Very interesting. Compared to the last round, companies, many say they're going to raise their price, to mitigate or to share the additional tariff cost. But this time, they try not to directly raise price, but to, limit the promotion, limit the discount they're going to offer to consumers. So maybe next time when you go shopping, you can pay more attention to how discount is changing right now. Yeah. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay. And also, besides the tariff, the current macroeconomic environment is not that kind of inspiring or encouraging, as well. Even though most companies, or at least more than half of the respondents, expect their sourcing value or volume to increase this year, but in most cases, it's just very slight increase, very slight increase. Yeah, next slide. And this is consistent with some, additional forecast. This is not my forecast. I'm an economist, so don't trust my forecast. Five economists will give you 10 different answers. This is the forecast by, a consulting company, a well-known consulting company leveraging a lot of survey and data. They forecast zero growth of U.S. apparel retail sales this year. Zero growth. Yeah. So I know this is not exactly something we would love to see. I personally actually didn't recall really buy a lot of clothing. How about you? Emily, did you buy a lot of clothing this year?
I bought some clothing, but I think I'm the exception.
Okay. Yeah. But truly, you can really tell the sentiment, including among consumers these days. Yeah. Yeah. Next slide, please.
But there is a bright spot, I will say, jumping right in here. Um, and then I will say I'm happy for this bright spot as a Gen Z. There is demand for talent. So we do see that 87% of companies actually plan to increase their hiring over the next few years. What's really particularly interesting, however, is what positions they're hiring for. So as you can see, the positions that are in highest demand are data scientists, trade compliance specialists, environmental sustainability specialists. So they're not your standard or typical fashion job.
Yeah. And they're not fashionable, right? Just like me, but they're very important in their job. Yeah. Next slide, please.
And now we're going to talk a little bit more about sourcing diversification 2.0 in 2026. So let's dive right in. On the screen, you can see is the respondents' top 10 apparel sourcing bases in 2026. And really what's interesting here is the number of countries actually went up from 2025. So they sourced from 49 countries, up from 46 countries. This shows once again that we're remaining geographically relatively diverse. The top five countries remain Asian countries, but all of their utilization rates actually declined, as well as three non-Asian countries made it to the top 10 list, and all their utilization rates all actually increased.
Yeah.
What really this demonstrates is a regional rebalancing that Dr. Sheng and I believe is occurring.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think 2 years ago, yeah, please go to the next slide. Yeah. Yeah, 2 years ago, I still call this the most boring graph I keep updating each month, but now it becomes the most interesting and intriguing graph I keep updating each month. So basically, it shows, from where U.S. companies source their apparel products. The red bar refers to Asia. Okay, and why it is becoming more interesting and intriguing is, finally, I see Asians' market share went down. Okay, and also very interesting. No, you thought Asia's market share went down because more companies do more nearshoring, from CAF to DR, from USMCA region, but it's not the case. Emily, shake her head. Yeah, exactly the same. But actually, most of the increase went to the rest of the world. The yellow part, the rest of the world, they see some significant or more noticeable market share increase. Yeah. once again, this echo the keywords regional balancing. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so then we looked at how diversified a company's current apparel sourcing base is. And so, what's interesting here is, Dr. Liu, don't you think that this slide seems kind of contradictory?
Yeah, I totally agree because on one side, we find that more companies they report sourcing from more than 10 different countries, right?
Exactly. But when we looked at companies that source from more than 20 different countries, that actually went down
Went
from
down, yeah.
20% to 7%. So once again, this is that regional rebalancing that we're kind of seeing occur. But it's also recommending that at the vendor level, we're becoming more consolidated.
Yeah. Or, we can say, in terms of sourcing diversification, it becomes more targeted, more measured. It's not simply, oh, let's just expand into more countries. No, they're more measured, more targeted, and even there can be more variation at the company level. Yeah. Next
Definitely.
slide, please.
And the next slide really shows this even more. As you can see, the number, this is companies' apparel sourcing strategy over the next 2 years. And as you can see, sourcing from more countries or more suppliers is not what companies are planning on doing. They're actually planning on sourcing from fewer suppliers or vendors, as you can see with that 47.4%. And this just kind of reflects once again that more consolidated, more measured and specific approach that companies are taking to who they select as their vendors.
Yeah. Next slide, please.
And these key themes are, the key themes that we really found from the quotes that came from directly from these businesses. As you can see on the screen, fewer countries and fewer vendors to reduce risk with suppliers. But the quote that I really want to point out that I think highlights the sourcing strategy over the next 2 years really well is expanding into new regions with the ultimate goal of pulling back in others.
Yeah, once again, just like, reinforce the keywords we come up with, regional balancing. Yeah.
Next slide.
Okay.
And then we looked at whether companies will plan on increasing or decreasing their sourcing value over the next 2 years. And really, could you tell us, Dr. Liu, who the key winners were last year in 2025?
Yeah, and I do remember last year's data was much simpler to interpret because there were a few, right? I mean, truly there are a few, winners out there like Cambodia, like India, definitely. Respondents kind of unanimously plan to increase sourcing from these countries. But don't you think this graph is more diverse, right? Less concentrated, or it's really hard to identify any clear winners here?
Exactly. It's so hard to identify clear winners because really there is none. It's a more diverse range of countries this year. We believe that this is company specific as well, depending on one's company strategy versus another. And another important thing to point out as well is that we're seeing more non-Asian countries make it to the list. Once
Yeah.
again, recommending that regional rebalancing.
Yeah, last year I do remember, the top, I mean, sourcing destinations companies want to expand into, and they were predominantly Asian countries, but this year is more diverse in these regions. Yeah.
Exactly. Next slide. And this is China. So, as I know, some of you are probably very interested in what's going to happen with China over the next 2 years. Dr. Liu, what was the typical strategy that people took towards China, these last 2 years?
Yeah, so as you may remember, I mentioned at the very beginning, the common perception is, companies will reduce their China exposure, like less de-risking sourcing from China because of all these geopolitics. So, in the past few years, like almost all companies, or no, very, very high percentage of the respondents, they plan to further reduce sourcing from China. But this is not the case this time, right?
This is not the case. So, actually, what we found was that the number of companies planning to increase sourcing from China actually went up, and the percentage of companies that actually plan to decrease sourcing dropped dramatically, almost by 50, more than 50%. So, really, this once again recommends that regional rebalancing that we're seeing, but it also shows that China is still a key player in the supply chain for these apparel and fashion companies.
Yeah, and just want to add one more thing. If you hadn't had a chance, I would encourage the audience to check the OTEXA trade data for May. Actually, U.S. apparel imports from China in May went up substantially, much, much faster than the rest of the world. So, when we know at the beginning of the year, and China's market share went down, significantly, but just all of a sudden it reversed in May. Yeah.
Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so this graph shows the trend of nearshoring, okay, from CAFTA-DR member from USMCA. So Emily, what's your impression about this graph? Besides I created, so it looks very professional, right?
It looks so professional. It makes me a little bit sad, Dr. Liu. I will be honest, a
Why?
little bit
Why?
sad. I'm not seeing, much growth, and I would have expected or hoped for more growth
Yeah.
in CAFTA DR regions.
Right. Now, really, it depends on how you interpret it, right? You can say it's very stable, or it can be interpreted as lack of growth, right? But one thing here, here I'd like to add is the context. Okay, remember since last year, U.S. apparel imports from CAFTA-DR, from USMCA, they enjoy far more significant tariff advantage. But despite of these advantages, the growth is not here, or did not happen. Yeah. Next slide, please. But also, I just feel the situation is not that simple, or still there's something going on behind the scene. For example, one thing is definitely, very encouraging to see, that is the utilization rate for CAFTA-DR and for USMCA went up, especially, so far this year. And also you can see, it's not just the overall utilization rate went up, especially those imports that comply with the so-called yarn forward risk margin went up substantially. And also, at the same time, but this is really something interesting, and I hear, different voices, including last week at the symposium. That is the percentage of imports from USMCA, from CAFTA-DR that claim the TPL. No, TPL is particularly for USMCA. And the next slide. Next slide is the CAFTA-DR, the same trend, higher utilization rate for this agreement, especially those complying with the yarn forward rule, but much fewer products, utilized the short supply list, even though we know more products actually were added to the short supply list in the most recent month. So something definitely happened. Okay. Yeah. Next slide. Okay. So my point here is not, who is right, who is wrong, or what strategy, is the preferred one. But the question in my mind is, what is the outlook, or what is the future of nearshoring when fashion brands and retailers, they're trying to do regional balancing? Right? So here you can see very interesting when we asked respondents what kind of products you plan to increase sourcing from CAFTA-DR, from USMCA, from Mexico in particular. The top products in their minds are still t-shirts and basic items. Okay, I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying, is this what you want to see? So that's number one. Number two is looking at the lower right. Okay, actually, in the past, I see very similar trend. The same or very similar percentage of respondents they plan to source from CAFTA-DR, from Mexico. But this time, far more companies say, I do not plan to increase sourcing from Mexico. And we know what could be the reason. That is the uncertainty associated with the future of USMCA, especially when you see the next slide. Yeah, companies say the most important factor that drives their sourcing from the region is the duty-free benefits and also, speed to market. But also, if you had a chance to read the benchmarking study, we include a section about how U.S. fashion brands and retailers see the competitiveness of major sourcing destinations. And I want to add here is actually, CAFTA DR and Mexico, their competitiveness is far more just about speed to market. They also, for example, can offer relatively lower compliance risk compared with suppliers from Asia. But somehow, still, I feel like the impression is, the top products, I would source from the region is these basic items. So how to really expand, sourcing from the region, I think, it will be, or the conversation will continue to be a very interesting topic, this year and ongoing, yeah. Yeah, next slide, please. Oh, AGOA. So your turn, Emilie.
AGOA, yes, of course. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the African Growth and Opportunity Act. As we all know, there was a 1-year renewal of AGOA. However, this short-term renewal of AGOA has created tons and tons of uncertainty around AGOA and has really hurt U.S. apparel sourcing from this region. We see that respondents sourced from far fewer AGOA members in 2026 as compared to 2024, as well as the utilization rate is below 15%. A lot of members are just shifting to sourcing from one AGOA member. And this is occurring at the same time that we're seeing broad support for long-term AGOA renewal. So, we see from the industry support for renewal of AGOA for at least 10 years is at 79%. Long-term AGOA renewal is critical for sourcing, 53% agreed. And really, what this slide's recommending is saying that maybe the short-term renewal that we have currently of the 1 year isn't going to be enough for AGOA.
Yeah, and just want to add one point here is, having a predictable and foreseeable future for sourcing from the region is very, very critical. Why? Because, for U.S. fashion brands and retailers, if they want, relatively, cost-efficient products, of course, they will consider Asia, right? Speed to market, of course, they will consider Western Hemisphere, CAFTA DR, Mexico, or even USA. So there's kind of no compelling reason I have to source from AGOA, right? So that's number one. Number two is thinking about the region, okay? And currently, despite all these support, third country fabric rule, still mostly, companies source relatively basic items from the region, okay? How to source more products, how this region can develop more capacity, they need investment. But investment won't come unless you have, okay, a foreseeable future and long enough. Okay, 1 year renewal, no, I'm not going to make a new investment that needs 10 years to give me the return of investment, especially textile mills, textile manufacturing capability. So this is why, from the perspective of brands and retailers, they really need to see long-term renewal. And also, somehow, and Emilie, totally, you can disagree with me. Somehow I find that, the interest level for, AGOA renewal somehow is declining this year compared to the past. I do recall back in 2018, 2017, there's a high level of interest of, let's investing more in a region because I really want to leverage the 10-year renewal of the agreement to do something more. But this time, even though it's still a non-controversial issue, so nobody really opposed renewing this trade preference program. But, if I left, it's very hard to bring me back. So that's my personal interpretation of the situation here. Yeah. Okay, so next slide, please.
Then
Okay.
we looked at the allocation of resources for sustainability and social compliance in 2026. And I will say, here's another bright spot in our day. 73% of respondents actually plan to increase resources. 40% of respondents actually plan to increase their operational budget. But really, what we can see here is that compliance is becoming a much broader term. In the past, we thought of compliance as simply conduct more audits, but now compliance is looking at other top priorities. So things like developing or sourcing new preferred sustainable textile materials, preparing for or complying with new sustainability regulations, traceability technologies, as well as collecting and reporting ESG data.
Yeah, and also I think this is exactly the reason why companies they will or they have become more careful in adding more vendors, or they only want to work with the most capable vendor, who can provide me not just a product, but also a lot of data I need to,
Of course.
collect, need to compile and eventually need to report to a lot of
Yes.
stakeholders. Yeah,
Yes. These vendors definitely need to have this compliance capability to them.
yeah,
Next slide, please. And one great example of new regulation coming out that companies are going to have to pay attention to is EPR, or extended producer responsibility. This has broad impacts for the fashion companies, particularly when it comes to things like traceability. As you can see, the number one issue is that it increased requirements for companies' traceability and in turn increased compliance and reporting costs. And this is just something to be aware of. I think for sourcing diversification 2.0, being able to understand these regulations, being able to comply with these regulations is going to be an important factor.
totally agree. Yeah.
Next slide. And then we looked at an interesting question, which is, do companies currently use AI or machine learning tools to support apparel sourcing and trade? And we did see that companies are actually leveraging AI in their business day-to-day operations. And so you can see on the screen, demand forecasting and inventory planning is a large one. Sustainability tracking we've seen. But we are even seeing companies use AI for things like sample development and shipping optimization. So once again, sourcing diversification 2.0 is really going to leverage these technologies, and AI is going to play an important part.
Or new factor that will affect how companies and from where companies will source their products.
Exactly. Next slide.
Okay, just let you know, even though you may already feel, well, that's a lot, right? A lot of useful information, but we actually include more very timely and important topic in this year's benchmarking study from companies, their detailed sourcing base, sourcing portfolio, not just for the finished garments, but also for the textile raw materials, how they look at the competitiveness and also weakness of major sourcing destinations. Forced labor, comply with UFLPA or even, their trade policy priorities. So definitely we would love to see you read the report and feel free to let us know if you have any questions. So I think Emily and I will just stop here for our presentation, but we are happy to answer any questions.
I think I'm seeing a question here actually. Were you surprised to see countries like Egypt and Jordan gaining ground? And what do you think they offer that companies value in 2026?
So Emily, do you want to go? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get started with that. I think that the increased sourcing from Egypt and Jordan really reflects once again, like we've been harping on and saying again and again, this regional rebalancing. It's just this idea that like U.S. companies plan to source from more non-Asian countries. What else do you have to add, Dr. Liu?
Yeah, just two more things to add. And one is, this result, revealed in our benchmarking study, they're highly, highly consistent with the macro trade data. Okay, if you look at OTEXTA data, exactly the same. And in my mind, definitely, I'm thinking about, trade agreements because truly these days tariff, or if there's any chance to reduce the impact of tariff, that's a plus. So we have, U.S. Jordan trade agreements. Actually, yesterday, a new reciprocal trade agreements was reached. Okay, so that's a positive sign. Okay, and also imports from Egypt can be qualified for QIZ. I think definitely don't overlook the impact of these trade agreement on companies sourcing.
Mm.
One more thing I want to add is investment. There is a saying, follow the money. I think, these days, especially in the case of Jordan, a lot of their garment factories are invested by Asians. So I feel like this may also be a factor, especially China. They invest a lot in the garment factories in Jordan. So even though for the finished garments, China is losing market share, but their investment actually, is all of the world. So yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you for that answer. I think the next question we have is there a chance China could start to regain ground as a sourcing destination in the coming years, or are brands committed to diversification and keeping their sourcing volumes from China stable?
That's a great question, and I'll just take the first part of the question. I think, when we're talking about China, I was particularly impressed to see that companies rated China even more competitive in the business performance in terms of things such as costs. Costs was almost as competitive as sourcing from Bangladesh. Other things they were rated competitively as was flexibility and agility, minimum
Mm.
order quantity, vertical manufacturing capacity. And these are all really, really important factors when companies are deciding whether they're going to source or not from China or any other location. I think, after a few years of significantly cutting sourcing from China, it's almost time to rebalance, or that's what we're seeing from companies is this
Mhm.
rebalancing, where, where companies are starting to source from China again, but I think it's unlikely that we'll see China regain the same level of market share as they had in the past.
Yeah, and I totally agree. A few things to add here. One is just as Emily just mentioned, China definitely demonstrate, even stronger competitiveness this year in some key performance areas like flexibility and agility. Vertically integrated production, very low minimum order quantity. These are the factors companies definitely emphasize a lot these days. I'll put it this
Mhm.
way, unlike some countries, I find somehow it's a lot easier to come in and come out of China, right? When you want to, expand sourcing into a new country, or expand your sourcing volume with an existing vendor often, you may worry about the capacity issue. Do they have the textile raw materials be ready? But usually, this is not a big issue for China because it is really strong in having a vertically integrated production chain. So that's number one. Number two is, this is my personal view, for your reference only. Somehow I find, it's no longer that relevant to measure China's influence and its success just based on its market share for finished garments. So my study also shows China is evolving. Its textile and apparel industry is evolving. So last fall, actually, I went to a conference in Singapore about the Asia Pacific textile and apparel supply chain. And I can tell you that a lot of companies there, China-based companies, they're talking about global sourcing as well. It's not like all the products made in China, sold in China are necessarily made in China. So Chinese company, they're shifting their role from just offering or supplying the finished garments into a role that they can coordinate the entire supply chain, right? And also I really recall last summer I went to Las Vegas attending the sourcing at Magic, and a lot of vendors they come from Cambodia, come from India. They're represented by Chinese. You can really tell, who really own these factories. Yeah, so I think China definitely still own these
Mhm.
or still have a lot of control over supply chain. So it's never really kind of being irrelevant. China is always relevant, but its role is still there. That being said, based on my analysis of companies' earning call transcript, or even have additional conversation with brands, retailers, I still do not see brands, retailers plan to substantially move their finished garment sourcing back to China. Okay, I don't think this is the trend yet, or I don't think this is going to happen because, once again, the reason why you source from China is not these volume products. Even when you look at companies, their factory level data, their contracted factory in China much, much smaller than those in Vietnam, in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, the typical size of a garment factory, 2,000 or even 5,000 workers. In China, much,
Mhm.
much smaller. So I think it's really show a very dynamic, very nuanced trend. Yeah, but I think this is exactly what's happening with sourcing, what's happening with the current business environment. Yeah, and
Well,
also
I think you're
this is why we need to do the benchmarking study again next year. Yeah.
agreed, agreed. And I think that your answer has inspired several more questions. We've received four
Wow. Oh,
questions
that's not
within the past
okay.
2 minutes. So
Okay.
here we
Okay.
go.
Uh,
We have a question here. Do you expect that other countries in Asia and Southeast Asia will sign a similar 10% agreement with the US?
oh, I need help. It's really here.
Thanks,
Okay,
Sheng.
Julie, it's your
You're
turn.
gonna
Yeah.
punt the hard question to me. Hi, thanks everybody for joining us today. And I do expect that more countries in Southeast Asia, well, and indeed around the world, will come back to the negotiating table for agreements with the US after the announcement of the next 301 tariffs. So any day now, we expect the announcement for the 301 forced labor tariffs. If that includes all 60 countries and the EU, then I think that will have a rush, even though the tariff is 10% or 12.5% if it stays stable from the original proposal. But then we also have the excess capacity 301 tariffs, and those are likely to come out in the next 2 weeks. I hate to make any estimates because it's very hard to know. It'll probably happen at 10:30 at night, hopefully not on a Friday night. But once we have both of those out there, and we have, of course, the new 338, a whole new type of tariff measure against Canada. And today, the 301 tariffs on Brazil went into effect. So I think the point of the administration is to ratchet up the pressure to get more countries to the negotiating table. And I think we'll see them pretty fast after those deals.
Amazing. Thank you, Julie. Our next question asks, does the study reflect any element related to the importance of traceability for brands and how this aspect could become relevant for the CAFTA region?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, Emily, I can start. Feel free to jump in. One is, I think, really, just, echo what Emily just mentioned in her presentation. Companies are fully aware of the changing regulatory environment, especially new legislation like EPR. Of course, also includes, UFLPA, and also, earlier this year, the new executive order on strengthened custom enforcement. So all of them send a strong signal, okay? Okay, for brands and retailers, it is your responsibility, or you are highly, highly expected, to have the full information about your supply chain. Okay, whether you like it or not, you're going to be asked to share a lot of additional data with a lot of stakeholders, not necessarily the custom and border protection, but a lot of stakeholders. They want more data from you. Of course, you have to, strengthen your capability. Okay, no matter to leveraging your internal team, hire more talents, and also leveraging AI. But definitely, this is a capacity company have to continue to strengthen and develop because this is the future or increasing expectation for brands and retailers these days. Yeah. And Emily, you have something to add?
No, I think that was a beautiful answer, Dr. Lowe.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Our next question is, from your perspective, what needs to change for the CAFTA region to become more competitive and capture a larger share of U.S. sourcing?
I think the one obvious thing, and Dr. Liu, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the biggest thing I think is investment. Obviously, we need investment so CAFTA DR can do other capabilities other than just making t-shirts. Dr. Liu, what do you think?
I totally agree with you. One is truly, it's capacity, especially, the capacity to make different kinds of products. I always use this example. It's not like, there's something wrong with making t-shirts, making niche products. We need these products, but I only need so many t-shirts in my closet, right? So how many more you can buy? The same with our university, right? How to increase enrollment the most efficient way. I'm not saying this is the only way, but usually the most efficient way is to add more popular majors, like data scientists, like sustainability, right? These are the areas, people will show more interest. So if you only rely on what you're currently, good at doing, I know the supply chain can be very, very integrated. You already have a very mature supply chain out there, know how to comply with the yarn full rule. But if you only can do that, the growth potential is not that much. Instead, I would love to see, CAFTA region, especially some leading companies out there. I think, last year, we do see some very positive sign, within CAFTA, besides the US, within CAFTA countries, they start to form a regional supply chain for textile raw materials. Like some yarns are produced in El Salvador, sent to Guatemala to made into garment. I'd love to see more of this kind of regional supply chain capability be developed, but it wouldn't happen naturally. Just like Emilie mentioned, we need new investment to come into play. And also, I think this is also something very important, the impression, the perception about this region. I had the opportunity to visit, one CAFTA members 2 years ago, and I learned so much, and it really changed my understanding about this region. I think as our benchmarking study just shows, this region is more than just about being able to make basic t-shirts. So I'm not saying they can only make t-shirts, just people thought they can only make t-shirts, right? So how to further to promote your additional capability and also additional critical factors like sustainability, circularity. Actually, Emilie and I, we just did another study on textile to textile recycling capability in CAFTA region. I think more such kind of message, needs to be shared among, U.S. fashion brands and retailers, or among, all these kind of, stakeholders along the supply chain to help the public to know that this region, can do far more than just about basic t-shirts. I think this can really help. Yeah. And also, I want to really emphasize, still, there's a genuine interest among brands and retailers to expand nearshoring. Okay, this is a non-controversial, okay, and they do not see this is totally contradictory with their expansion or their sourcing from the rest of the world. There's so many benefits of expanding nearshoring, and a lot of stakeholders are here as well, including supporting the U.S. domestic textile industry. I think, yeah, so why not? Let's just make it happen. To keep talking about new investment, new opportunities, and new advantages. Yeah.
Well, that perfectly dovetails into our next question. Speaking of nearshoring, can nearshoring speed to market really compensate for the lower prices in Asia? And if so, how?
Um, I think I love both coffee and tea, so I don't want to just simply give up any of them. So I think, companies, they source different regions for different kinds of products. Okay. And sourcing is far more than just about cost, and also far more than just about speed to market. For many years, we emphasize, or, what the results tell us is companies, their sourcing formula is getting more and more sophisticated and more nuanced and balanced. They want to see balanced sourcing destinations, can offer all these kind of factors and also low risk. This is the ideal situation, just nobody is perfect, right? So the thing is, this is also something we mentioned briefly, in the report. Somehow, the performance or the advantage of speed to market of Western Hemisphere, including in the US, went down. Personally, I think maybe this is because of the emergence of e-commerce. We need to pay more attention to the supply chain of e-commerce. It is not traditionally, you use cargo shipping, ocean shipping, but e-commerce these days, they use a lot of air shipping. They have the warehouse in the US. Their supply chain can also offer speed to market. So I think this is, like a competition, intensified competition with nearshoring. So once again, I think, the best way is to think about something else beyond your current advantage. Okay. Or if you think you can only rely on your current advantage, you can expand more sourcing. I think probably there's some, significant challenges ahead of you. So.
Perfect. I thank you for answering that question. We just got another one here. Did you see any changes in the data after de minimis ended?
I have to admit, we didn't really include any questions about de minimis this time. Yeah, and I cannot say, yeah, what I don't know. Yeah, but I agree, this is a very important question. Yeah, and happy to, write a new paper about that. Okay.
That's right. More papers can always be written. We have another question here. Do you think the volatility around preference program renewals will have a permanent negative impact in those specific countries going forward? Or do you think long-term renewal will help investment bounce back?
Emilie, do you want to say something first? No? I would say if company leave any of these trade preference program countries like AGOA, it will be more costly to bring them back. Okay, the thing is for company, it's about not just about, let's just find a new vendor. It's about a lot of things, right? Like investing the factories, figure out the supply chain, right? The most important investment is the supply chain. It's not simply about the product. So if companies left because they don't feel like the current situation can give them assurance, predictability, and you want to bring them back, I think it will cost you more. Okay. And also why we really emphasize on investment is because like AGOA or maybe Haiti as well, they're different from Asia. Asia very mature, right? And just like, so it's very mature. So you can place orders at any time, in any quantity, with any combination, and they can get you very quickly. But this is not the case for AGOA. You have to place pre-orders, right? And then waiting for, I don't know, 1 year, 2 years before you can really get your products. Who's going to do that, right? So without investment, there will be no expansion of capacity, and this will be like a vicious cycle. No expansion, and who is going to invest further, right? And also here, investment is not just finished garments. It's also talking about, the textile raw materials. And usually only the sourcing volume for finished garments go up, then investment for textile raw materials will more likely to come in. So it's really connected to each other. So the best way, once again, the best way is to provide a foreseeable future to encourage long-term investment. And then the region, can play a more significant role as a sourcing destination. Yeah.
Continuing that same sourcing thread, we have another question here. Do you think the war in Iran will shift sourcing strategies, and which regions are going to benefit from that?
I probably will have to ask for help again. Julie, do you have something to add here? Like the geopolitics of trade?
Yeah, thanks for punting these difficult questions to me. Well, it is kind of interesting that we haven't heard a lot from brands yet that the geopolitical concerns are forcing a wholesale shift in sourcing. But I do want to say I met with a delegation in town from Jordan earlier this week who was here for the signing, of course, of their agreement. And they expressed, they had questions as well. They're not seeing cancellations of orders, but they're concerned that if the war continues, and especially if the disruption to supply lines or bombing in our partners in the region continue, that yes, we could see some impact. But so far, I think our sector has been less impacted than a lot of others, like oil and gas or the polyester folks. And but it's a concern.
Mm.
Yeah, totally agree. And also probably cost, because it's the same shipping company. If they have to pay more for their shipping from this region, even if it's not for apparel, but the overall rate for shipping went up. And this is reflected in our benchmarking study this year.
Yeah, and I do think that's going to be an ongoing issue, is the disruptions are going to flow into the cost. And so if we're seeing more tariffs and we're seeing more higher costs because of the geopolitical disruptions, that's going to have an even bigger impact on the very sad slide that showed no forecast of retail growth for this year. So we have to hope that we overcome that.
Mm. Well, thank you for the answer to that question. It looks like we might just have one final question here. That question is,
Well,
why
these are
do
all really great questions.
I know, I know. We've had such an active audience. Please don't
Yeah.
hesitate. Continue to send questions. I will throw up slides at the very end that do show Dr. Lou's and Emilie's email addresses. And of course, the USFIA is always happy to share information with you by emailing info@usfashionindustry.com. But it does seem here that our last question here is, why do you think respondents are expressing lower sentiment about the industry over the next 5 years, despite the hiring bump?
Yeah. Emilie, do you want to take? It's the graph showing the 5-year outlook, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things to say is just the hiring bump. If you look at what they're specifically hiring for, I think it reflects really well what's going on in the industry. So compliance specialists, sustainability specialists, I think that reflects it well. Dr. Liu, do you have anything to say about the zero growth, however?
Yeah, well, I think I totally agree with you that the job market actually is a little bit different. I still believe
Mm.
it shows some, bright spot or positive sign. And also it's understandable because the nature of the business is changing. Therefore companies have to, have new talents, like a new engine to drive their business. But in terms of, the overall sentiment towards the next 5 years or so, I think it's just like Julie told us. Do you feel like you're more, kind of assured or have more worries, right? Like truly business hate uncertainty. And also, as I mentioned, even though you have the same challenges, okay, from last year, but you can even interpret it in this way. None of the challenges I faced last year is gone, and they're still there, and somehow become even worse. Okay, and just want to add one more thing, i.e., tariff refund. Okay, you thought these, refund is helpful, sure. They can provide some temporary relief, but a lot of companies mentioned in their earning call transcript, they assume, okay, the upcoming new tariff will totally wipe out the refund
Mm.
they got, even though some even haven't really got much refund. But the situation, like the tariff situation, got even worse. Cost, okay, you can recall, you can check the report this year. The cost pressure went up from last year. Okay, inflation, factory cost, the raw material cost, and also the shipping and logistic. And even forced labor was not that a big issue last year, but it's coming back. Companies say, they have to pay even more attention, or CBP is kind of, emphasizing more on the enforcement of forced labor, especially after the release of the executive order. So yeah, somehow I just feel companies feel more stressed about the challenges they're facing and also a lot of uncertainty, business hurt uncertainty. Yeah. So I hope
Absolutely.
I answered the question.
I think that was a great answer, and thank you for making that distinction because it is pretty important to look and consider that just because an isolated job market is doing well, that doesn't necessarily indicate the overall positive growth of the industry, as you indicated within your slides. And looking at the what was a 1% growth last year turned to a 0% growth this year. It's pretty stark. That does seem to be the last question we have here from
I passed the defense. We passed the defense. Thesis defense.
Yes, exactly. Congratulations. I'm going to throw up the slides right here for everybody that is still on the call. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We love having an audience that we can share all of this incredible information with. Every single registrant will receive a copy of the slides as well as um, a copy of the slides, the benchmarking study, and the recording of the webinar. So have no fear. If you have further information, questions, comments, etc., please don't hesitate. Share your questions with us. You can reach United States Fashion Industry Association, like I said, at info@usfashionindustry.com. And if you'd like to participate in next year's 2027 benchmarking survey, please scan that QR code that you see right there on the screen. It might be behind the speaker, so if that's the way it looks on your screen, move that bar over. We would love to have you be a participant next year if you weren't already a participant this year. And you can also sign up to join that outreach list simply by accessing the link on our website if you aren't interested in scanning the QR code. There we go. Of course. Alrighty. Thank you so much for joining. That does conclude the end of the session, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.